Hi, friends. I'm Father Kerry Walters, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. This one about an often overlooked moral dilemma embedded within a very familiar tale. The tale is told in the novel Murder on the Orient Express, written by Agatha Christie, who most people acknowledge as the mistress of detective stories. The book has been read by literally millions of people since it first appeared. It has never gone out of print, and it just may well be Christie's most popular story. To my knowledge, at least 5 film versions of her novel have been made. The latest one was released just this month. It was directed by and stars Kenneth Branagh. It is a visually luscious film, even though Branagh takes some imaginative license, in recreating Christie's novel for the big screen. My guess is that most people have either read the novel or seen one of the film versions of it, but just in case you haven't, I want to give you fair warning right now that I'm about to offer a very quick summary of the plot. The action takes place on the Orient Express, which is a rather famous train that runs from Istanbul to Western Europe. And the action takes place over just 2 days. There are several passengers on the train, and one of them is one of Agatha Christie's most famous creations, Hercule Poirot. Poirot is a Belgian detective. He often likes to call himself the most famous detective in the entire world. He's a really eccentric character. I don't know if he's lovable, but he certainly is intriguing. He's a relatively short man. He is always very meticulously and even primly groomed. He loves the good life. He loves fine wines and fancy foods, although it's difficult to imagine him overindulging in either because he seems to be so tightly wound. He is primarily a thinker. He likes to refer to what he calls the little gray cells, his brain, as the primary tool of detection that he uses. He very rarely shows any display of emotion. He is, if you will, a kind of Belgian Sherlock Holmes, although even more eccentric than Sherlock Holmes was. So he's one of the passengers on this train, and the other passengers are an assorted, rather motley mix, ranging from an army colonel to a governess to a female missionary to a Russian dowager countess. One of the passengers is a rather rough customer named Ratchet. And he almost immediately goes to Poirot, because he knows that Poirot is the world's most famous detective, and asks Poirot to protect him. Ratchet tells Poirot that he has been receiving threats against his life. Poirot takes an immediate dislike to Ratchet, refuses to protect him, and that night Ratchet is murdered. His body is found the next morning, and it has been horribly wounded with 12 knife thrusts. The rest of the novel is Poirot interviewing all of the other passengers on the train, trying to figure out who the culprit is, because one of them must be the murderer. That's the assumption with which Poirot begins the investigation. By the time the investigation is over, the reader is astounded to learn that, in point of fact, all 12 passengers are murderers. It seems that Ratchet, under a different name, had kidnapped and murdered a child in the United States, had been tried with the crime, and through a very strange and utterly unjust turn of circumstances was acquitted. All of the 12 other passengers in the Orient Express were connected in one way or another with the family, the Armstrong family, whose child was kidnapped and murdered. And this is their way of taking vengeance upon Ratchet. So each of them creep into his sleeping berth at night with a single knife, and each of them take turns stabbing him to death. Poirot eventually realizes that this is what has happened, but he seems to be almost uncharacteristically touched by the story that unfolds. He's not a very, again, emotional man, and he's always been a strict enforcer of the law. But he is moved enough at this time to come up with a couple of different explanations for what might have happened, because the cops are going to have to be eventually notified. Either the police can be told that Ratchet was murdered by someone who then escaped into the night, or the police can be told the truth. Then Poirot leaves it up to the people themselves to decide which story the police will hear. He, as it were, absolves himself of having to turn them in, and he seems to be relatively at peace with this decision. That's the dilemma. What should be done when a person deliberately murders another person in circumstances that seem to be just? Here's this horrible man, Ratchet, who kidnapped an innocent infant and then murdered the infant, who got away with this crime scot-free. Is there any reason for private individuals, especially those who were most affected by his crime, not to take the law into their own hands? On the one hand, as a general rule, we would think that that is not something that would be desirable in society. On the other hand, many of us have the instinct that somehow redress has to be made. Somehow restoration is called for. And if the courts won't do it, then it might be legitimate, although not ideal, for private individuals to do it. That's the moral dilemma. That's the question that Agatha Christie's novel raises without really bothering to answer. I would suggest to you that there's a fine line being drawn in this novel between what we might call revenge on the one hand and justice on the other. The two very frequently seem to have close relationships. In fact, they can sometimes, at least from an outsider's observation, seem to converge. But ultimately, I would want to suggest to you that there is a difference, and it's a difference that we would do well to heed. Justice tends to be an enterprise that we enter into rationally and unemotionally as possible. It does seek to restore a state of affairs that has been knocked out of balance by a crime or an injustice, as we say. It seeks to vindicate victims. Vengeance or revenge, on the other hand, tends to be an act that's very emotional, that's very personal. It doesn't seek so much to vindicate as it seeks to express vituperation and anger. And although it seems to think that it can restore a balance, what happens in point of fact with vengeance is that it only creates more imbalance by defying what most people would consider to be standard moral norms. I think one of the best criticisms of revenge or vengeance that we're likely to find was written in 1625 by the British philosopher and statesman Francis Bacon in an essay of his entitled On Revenge. Let me just read a tiny portion of that essay, because I think that what Bacon does in it is to really capture something important about revenge. This is what he writes. Revenge, he says, is a kind of wild justice, which the more man's nature runs to, the more ought law to weed it out. For as for the first wrong, it doth but offend the law, but the revenge of that wrong pulleth the law out of office. Certainly, in taking revenge, a man is but even with his enemy, but in passing it over, he's superior, for it is a prince's part to pardon. And Bacon goes on to say, that which is past is gone and irrevocable, and wise men have enough to do with things present and to come. His point is that revenge somehow doesn't restore order, but in point of fact exacerbates the disorder that the person who seeks revenge is trying to right or trying to level out. The person who commits a crime or who commits an injustice breaks the law. But the person who seeks vengeance upon that person pulls the law out of whack, upsets the moral order, according to Francis Bacon. And what's the purpose? To make oneself feel a little better, to try and reach closure, as we like to say these days, to try and expunge the deed's bleakness and darkness in a way that isn't quite explicable, but which we feel we can somehow accomplish. But what Bacon also says here, as you will remember, is that the past is over and done. The past is irrevocable. The past can't be changed. So revenge isn't going to accomplish anything that the person seeking revenge hopes that it will, thinks that it will. It's all the more remarkable that Poirot washes his hands of making the decision about what to do with the 12 passengers on the Orient Express who murdered Ratchet. We're told in several of Agatha Christie's novels that he's a good Catholic. He has a strong moral conscience. I can appreciate that Poirot was moved by the pain and the suffering of these 12 people when they thought about the horrible crime that was committed against this innocent child. And I don't know what I would have done in his place, if I would have actually turned them into the police, or if I, like he, would have walked away. That's where the moral dilemma comes in. But I do want to suggest to you that things aren't as simple as Agatha Christie makes them in this novel. I recognize that the novel is a mystery and not a treatise on moral philosophy. Granted, but it does seem to me that we need to think deeply about the distinction between revenge and justice, and to keep in mind Francis Bacon's warnings against revenge, regardless of how comfortable and satisfying, at least in the short term, an act of vengeance might feel. Remember what Francis Bacon says: revenge is a kind of wild justice, and the very wildness of it means that it can grow and grow and grow until it overtakes everything that we thought we were intending to redress. So I believe that Agatha Christie's novel leaves us with this very important dilemma to ponder on, to take away from the novel with, and to see how we would apply the distinction between revenge and justice in our own lives. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you very much, and I will see you next time.